Hey everybody, and welcome to your nutrition lecture. I actually didn't realize that Zoom has filters, and I actually put a little flower on my face. But anyways, let's go ahead and jump right into it. All right. So this is a nutrition lecture, which is chapter 23 in your textbook. Please ignore the scratching on the door of my dog. They were barking. Dogs. They were barking, and I don't want them back in because they're going to bark some more. So they'll give up eventually. So anyways, nutrition, chapter 23 in your textbook. So first, it's a little, well, actually your lecture objectives, there are actually no lecture objectives in your lecture notes for this lecture, mostly because there's a lot in this nutrition chapter, and we're not going to cover a lot of it. And we're going to give you a kind of more simple version of that chapter. So no lecture objectives because we're not following the ones in the textbook. So we're just going to go through all the nutrients together. Okay, so nutrients are basically any substance in food that the body uses to promote normal growth, maintenance, and repair. So some specific things that we do is ATP synthesis. So of course we use our glucose to make ATP. And we'll actually talk about how we use actually the other nutrients to also make ATP as well. We provide, or the nutrients provide monomers. So we just went over digestive system, and we break down the food that we eat into the monomers, and then the monomers are then used to build up new polymers that are used in the body, because the food molecules that we eat are not the same as the body molecules that we make. So we just break down the food into the monomers, the amino acids, the monosaccharides, and the glycerol and fatty acids, and we use that to make the proteins, carbs, and fats of our body. Okay, and then also these nutrients are going to be involved in chemical reactions, and we'll talk about those at the end of the lecture, the vitamins and minerals. Okay, so our nutrients that are used for health, the things that we eat that are used to keep our bodies running, are actually broken down into 5 different categories. The first set of categories are your proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Okay, which you've heard of these before. They were considered macromolecules when we talked about them in your organic chemistry lecture in Bio 32. We can now, during this nutrition lecture, refer to them as, I haven't used these drawing tools in a while. Instead of macromolecules, when we're talking about diet and nutrition, we're going to refer to them as macronutrients, actually. Now, you should remember that there is one more macromolecule, which are nucleic acids, but they provide very little to our diet and nutrition. So we actually are going to focus on proteins, carbs, and fats as far as our macromolecules or macronutrients go. So the other of those five categories, so our first 3 categories are proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, which are considered macronutrients. But then we also have vitamins and minerals. Those are considered micronutrients. And so those are our 5 categories: proteins, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Now, water is really important to mention too, because by volume, water makes up about 60% of our food. By volume is water. However, we're not going to, we're not going to focus on that for this lecture. We already talked about water and the importance of water in the, in Bio 32 at the very beginning in our chemistry, I think in the inorganic chemistry lecture. So we talked about surface tension and hydrogen bonding and things like that. So we have already covered water. So for this lecture, we're going to focus on these other 5 categories: proteins, carbs, fats, vitamins, and minerals. Okay, so you should all know the difference between essential nutrients and non-essential nutrients. So essential nutrients are nutrients that we need to get from our diet. So these are nutrients that cannot be made by the body. So again, we must get it in the diet. Now, our liver has the ability to convert a lot of substances into things that we need. So like we talked about in the digestive lecture that some monosaccharides that are not glucose can be converted into glucose by our liver. However, there are some of these nutrients that our liver cannot make. Okay, so it includes some vitamins, some amino acids, some fatty acids, most of our minerals, and then water in general. We can't make our own water, so we have to get that by ingesting it. Now, and we will actually talk about specific examples of some of these essential nutrients at the end of the lecture. But non-essential nutrients are those that if it's not in our diet, then our liver does have the ability to convert those or convert what we have into those if we need it. So if we have proteins or carbohydrates in excess, our liver can convert some of that into fats that we need. Okay, that's an example. So just for now, just know the difference between an essential versus a non-essential nutrient. Now, like I said, we aren't going to be diving really deep into this nutrition chapter. So please make sure that you're using your lecture notes as a reference if you are reading the book, because we're not going to cover everything. So what we are going to focus on is going to be nutrient intake, which if we compare this to our digestive lecture that we had last week, that's going to be this ingestion portion. So whatever we take in. Also, we're going to focus on nutrient release, which would happen when we break down the foods that we eat into their monomers, into those nutrients that we need. And then nutrient absorption, which is going to happen here at the small intestine. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on nutrient intake, nutrient release, and also nutrient absorption for this lecture. Okay, so this is probably the only key concept I'm going to bring up today, because the way that the lecture goes is that it kind of intros the different nutrients and then goes into the metabolism of each one, and then goes into more detail about each one of our macronutrients. But we're actually going to divide this into all about carbs, all about lipids, all about proteins. So, and then talk about the vitamins and minerals at the end. So I'm actually not going to be using all the key concepts from this textbook just because we're going to be bouncing around and I would have to mention them a couple of times. But the one main one is that carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins that we're going to be talking about not only supply energy, but they also are used for building blocks to build whatever proteins or lipids or carbohydrates that we need. So here is a diagram of the 3 stages of metabolism. So stage 1 is going to happen in the GI tract. This is us digesting the food that we eat and absorbing those nutrients in the small intestine, and eventually that gets transported into the blood and then our tissues. And we're going to talk about each one of these macromolecules in detail. But proteins get broken down to amino acids and absorbed. Carbohydrates get broken down to glucose and other sugars, other monosaccharides, and get absorbed. And then fats, lipids, get broken down into our glycerol and fatty acids. Now, the second stage of metabolism is what happens at the tissue level. So we're either going to do anabolism or cannibalism. So you should know that anabolism, I can type. Anabolism is a building up of the materials that we need. Oh man, it's not gonna let me move it now, but anabolism is the building up, and then catabolism, I'll write it over here. Is breaking down, okay? So metabolism here is happening at the tissue level. So we're either building things up using the nutrients that we've got from our food, or we're breaking things down. So as far as proteins go, we're going to talk about how we use the amino acids that we absorb in the GI tract to build proteins. Okay. And then also those amino acids can be converted into different forms of molecules that are used at different stages of the of respiration, of aerobic respiration. So we can use the amino acids to make a glucose intermediate to be used for glycolysis. We can use amino acids to make acetyl-CoA, which we'll talk about later, which actually enters our citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, which was mentioned in our in muscles for Bio32. And then more infrequently, we can use amino acids to as intermediates in the citric acid cycle itself. So again, we can use amino acids for different parts of the of respiration in order to make ATP. So it's not just glucose, right? We can actually convert different nutrients into intermediate substances that are used in aerobic, well, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Carbohydrates, we're going to be doing catabolism in order to break down the glucose during glycolysis and break down pyruvic acid even more during the citric acid cycle. And then finally, we'll have the electron transport chain where we make loads of ATP. For anabolism, or building things up, we're going to be putting together glucose molecules to form glycogen, okay, which is going to get stored in the liver. And it's our sugar storage. And then for fats, hey, we are going to break them down into their smaller components, which is going to be fatty acids and glycerol. Okay, and those glycerol can actually be converted into an intermediate of glucose that can be used for glycolysis to make some ATP and even more ATP as we move down that pathway. And then the fatty acids can be converted into acetyl-CoA, okay, in order to enter the citric acid cycle and make some ATP that way as well. That would be considered catabolism because we're breaking those things down to make ATP. Now for anabolism, okay, with fats, we can actually put those glycerol and fatty acids back together to make different types of triglycerides that our body needs. Okay, so we would store those in those forms. So again, anabolism is building things up while catabolism is breaking things down. And then the last stage of metabolism is what happens at the mitochondria, which is going to be your citric acid cycle, and then your electron transport chain. Now, you'll notice that a lot of these diagrams will have a lot of chemistry-like terms, but I'll let you know when you don't have to know what the terms are in the particular diagrams, because some of them are really complicated and I'm not going to make you know everything about those particular diagrams. Now, this one's pretty simple. Glucose gets broken down into pyruvic acid. Now, you should know that glucose is actually a 6-carbon molecule. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. During glycolysis, we're going to break that apart, okay, that glucose apart into 2 3-carbon molecules, which are pyruvic acid. And from there, in the citric acid cycle, we're actually going to be cleaving off 1 carbon at a time. And every time we do that, every time we break that bond, that carbon bond, we're going to release some energy, because remember that energy is stored in those covalent bonds. But not only are we going to be gaining energy from breaking those bonds, but we're actually going to be releasing these carbon molecules as CO2 and eventually breathing them out. So again, we have our glucose molecule that's going to be broken down into 2 3-carbon molecules, which are pyruvic acid. It will release a little bit of CO2 during that. And then when we go to the citric acid cycle and start breaking that carbon, those 3-carbon molecules down even more, every time we break off a carbon, we're going to be releasing some more CO2 in the process. Okay, and then eventually go to the electron transport chain and make lots and lots of ATP. Okay. So that's metabolism, a big overview of metabolism, but we're going to be talking about each one of these macromolecules one at a time in detail. So first off, carbohydrates. Okay, carbohydrates are used to produce or synthesize what? And this is where in class you guys would all Say ATP, okay. But also some are used for glycoproteins. Some of the glycoproteins that you are already familiar with that we've talked about in Bio 32 or Bio 33. Mucin is a glycoprotein that's used to make mucus. So just combine mucin with water and you have mucus. Also, erythropoietin is also a glycoprotein, which is used to make more red blood cells. And then also, let me see if I can remember without looking at my notes. It was mucin, EPO, and I can't remember. Okay, yeah, that was, sorry. And also intrinsic factor. And so remember that intrinsic factor is essential for vitamin B12 absorption. So mucin, EPO, and intrinsic factor, these are all glycoproteins. Okay, so we use carbohydrates that we eat. We break that down into glucose to make ATP, but also those sugars are also used to make some glycoproteins as well. Where we get carbohydrates, our sources are from plants. So we get a lot of our starchy carbohydrates from plant sources. So like our breads and pastas, things like that. We also get carbs from animals. So the meat that we eat has muscle cells. That's what we're eating the muscle. And those muscle cells have glycogen, because remember our muscles store glucose in the form of glycogen, our muscles and our liver. And so we have glycogen in the meat that we eat. And so that's how we get some of our carbohydrates. And then also milk products will also have lactose, and lactose are a disaccharide of galactose and glucose, which are two monosaccharides. Alrighty, so that's what we use ATP for, or so that's what we use carbs for, and then also where we get those carbs. Okay, so this is a more detailed breakdown of glycolysis. You don't have to know any of these intermediate terms, so you don't have to know fructose 1,6-biphosphate. You don't have to know these intermediates either. All you really need to take away from this is that glycolysis is the process in which we take a glucose molecule that we either absorbed from the small intestine or the liver converted one of those monosaccharides into glucose. And we use that for glycolysis to make some ATP. Now that glucose gets broken down into 2 pyruvic acids. Again, you don't need to know the whole process of how it gets there. If you were to take a cell biology class, you would have to know all of these things, but for now you do not. But that glucose is used to be broken down into 2 pyruvic acids. And again, because we're going to be breaking a bond, a covalent bond, we will release some energy. So we make about 4 ATP in glycolysis. However, we do actually use 2 ATP to start us off. So glycolysis actually has a net gain of 2 ATP. Okay, because again, we gain 4 ATP at the end there when we make that 2 pyruvic acid, when we cut that glucose in half into 2 3-carbon molecules. However, again, we use 2 ATP to start us off. So there's that saying, you need to have money to make money. Same thing, you got to have some ATP in order to make some ATP. There we go. So then from there, those 2 pyruvic acids will either go into the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle, if oxygen is present. That's considered the aerobic pathway. And then if there's not oxygen present, okay, then we'll go the anaerobic pathway where we only make 2 ATP per glucose. And we're going to be making a waste product of lactic acid in the process. And we'll talk about that in a second. So you should remember aerobic respiration. So we talked about glycolysis. Glycolysis where we take glucose, which is a 6-carbon molecule, and break it down into pyruvic acid, which is 2 3-carbon molecules. Okay, so 1 glucose into 2 of these pyruvic acids. And then from there, those 2 pyruvic acids will enter the citric acid cycle. And then from the citric acid cycle, that's going to produce a little bit of ATP. And we're going to be getting rid of a lot of CO2 at this stage. And then from there, we'll move on to the electron transport chain. And that's where we make our bulk of ATP. And then by the end, we will have net about 30 to 32 ATP, okay, per glucose molecule. Now your bio, or your, I don't know if it says it in these lecture notes, but your bio 32 lecture notes did give an estimate of about 36 ATP. However, that estimate is a little bit old, outdated. And we actually know now that we are actually closer to 30 to 32 ATP per glucose. And that's going to be dependent on everybody's different, everybody's body's different. Some are more efficient than others. And there may be times in your life where your body's more efficient than it was at a different time. So about 30 to 32 ATP per glucose. So again, just know that glucose is being used during glycolysis to break that down to 2-pyruvic acid. But this happens in the cytoplasm. Then those 2-pyruvic acids get transported to the mitochondria and enter the citric acid cycle. Well, there's an intermediate that enters the citric acid cycle. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But eventually, we get to the citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, make some ATP and release some CO2. And then we move on to the electron transport chain, where we make the bulk of our ATP, and we yield about 30 to 32 ATP per glucose. And now this is only if oxygen is present. If oxygen is present, then we can go into the mitochondria and complete that pathway. However, if we do not have oxygen, okay, we will not enter the mitochondria and go into the Krebs cycle. We'll actually do the anaerobic pathway instead. And with the anaerobic pathway, okay, we're not making 30 to 32 ATP. We're actually only making 2 ATP per glucose. And we produce 2 lactic acid molecules in the process. And you should know that lactic acid is a waste product of anaerobic respiration. So it's a waste product, and this waste product is removed by the liver. Okay, and in order to remove this lactic acid, what the liver actually does is it converts lactic acid into, actually let me make this bigger so it can all fit in one line. Yeah, converts lactic acid into glucose. And then you should know that this process to convert lactic acid into glucose costs oxygen. And I don't know if you remember this from Bio 32, but after you've had a really hard workout, okay, and maybe you've gotten to the point where you kind of tire yourself out, you may have had to switch to the anaerobic pathway if your muscles ran out of oxygen. But after you're done with that particular workout, you probably are breathing really, really heavy. And when you breathe really heavy, that is because you are paying off what's called an oxygen debt. Okay, and I don't know if you remember this either. In class, I would have asked you, what are the 3 things that we are replenishing during that time of paying off that oxygen debt? But when we are breathing heavy, okay, we're bringing in more than normal levels of oxygen, okay, in order to replenish the oxygen that we've used. So what we use that oxygen for specifically is, 1, we replace our oxygen stores, okay, in our muscles. Not only are we replacing oxygen itself, but we're also going to replace our ATP and creatine phosphate stores, and this requires oxygen in order to make that conversion happen. And then finally, we're going to do that conversion of lactic acid into glucose by the liver, and that also takes oxygen. Okay, so again, when we are in that time of oxygen debt, that time where we're breathing heavily, during that time, during that period, our liver is going to be converting lactic acid into glucose. And we're also going to be replenishing our O2, ATP, and creatine phosphate stores. So that's a little bit of Bio 32 review for you. Okay, so you should know how we use glucose for storage next. Okay, so, and you're already familiar with how we use glucose, at least short term, but short term, let me make this a different color. Short term, we are going to be converting any excess glucose into glycogen. I'm trying to like draw this little, I'm trying to highlight this arrow, but you know what I mean. So glucose to glycogen, you should know that this is a short-term storage. Short-term. So this is a short-term storage, okay? Short-term storage option. And then, however, later, when we need more glucose, the hormone glucagon, which is produced by which organ? Pancreas. Okay, so but glucagon triggers the conversion back to glucose. Okay, so you should know that. Oh, I wanted that to go here. That's okay. But you should know that the conversion of glucose into glycogen for storage is only a short-term storage. And as soon as our blood glucose levels drop, we will be converting that back into glucose. So we'll be going in this direction, this one right here. Try to color it in again, but I'm not very good at it. But we'll go in that direction. Okay. For long-term storage, okay, we're actually going to use a glucose intermediate that's kind of on its way down this glycolysis pathway, but we're going to be using this intermediate, and you don't have to know the name of this, just know that it's an intermediate of glucose on its way down the pathway of glycolysis. But that intermediate form can actually be converted into components of fats like your glycerol and fatty acids, and then from there get made into a triglyceride, and those triglycerides, they will then be stored in adipose tissue. So stored long-term in adipose tissue. And specifically, you should know that these cells that are going to be storing that fat, those triglycerides, are adipocytes. Oh my God, adipocytes. Okay, so our short-term storage is glycogen, while our long-term storage is going to be fat stored in adipocytes. Okay, and I think that's it for, oh no, one more thing. Okay, and then you should know that there are different forms of carbohydrates that we eat. We have complex carbohydrates, which are going to be our starchy materials like bread, cereal, crackers, flour, pasta, rice, potatoes. Those are complex carbohydrates, the ones I love the most, but my body hates the most. I think we all love, well, I love bread. I don't know about you guys, but I love me some bread. Those are complex carbohydrates. They break down much more slowly than simple carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates are monosaccharides and disaccharides. They're very small sugars, and if they're monosaccharides, there's really no digestion involved. You will drink that soda full of monosaccharides that'll go down into your stomach and small intestine and just get right absorbed because it doesn't need to be broken down anymore. So complex carbohydrates take long to be broken down, while simple carbohydrates, no, not long at all. We get simple carbohydrates from those sodas, from carbonated drinks, from candy, from fruit, from ice cream, from pudding, and some immature vegetables. Now, candy is a funny thing. You'll notice that a lot of sugary candies, like gummies or Twizzlers or things like that, a lot of those containers that they come in will say it's a fat-free food or a fat-free candy. Now, that's kind of like a marketing tactic for people who are maybe not very educated. Although they'll see this candy and say, well, it's fat-free, right? However, just because it's fat-free doesn't mean that your body can't make fat from it. So like we said before, long-term storage of sugar is in the form of fat. So if you're eating these fat-free foods in excess, your body will be turning in that excess sugar into fat. Okay. It is recommended that about 45 to 65% of our total caloric intake should be carbohydrates, should be from carbohydrates. However, worldwide, that number is higher. Your lecture notes say it's 70%, but I couldn't find a source to verify that. But it is going to be higher than this 45 to 65% of carbohydrates. Now, we've talked about this before. There are some third world countries that rely heavily on carbohydrates and don't get a whole lot of protein. Now, a lot of that's because in order to get protein, you need to grow and care for animals. In order to grow and care for animals, you need to feed them food. And that costs money, okay? So even though you'll be getting some meat out of it, some nutrition, it costs money to raise and eventually eat animal protein. So a lot of third world countries rely on carbohydrates, on rices and grains and potatoes and things like that for their diets. And they would be very lacking. We talked about stuff like ascites because they lack protein. They may lack albumin specifically, change the osmotic gradient of their body and cause them to not keep water in the plasma, and it seeps out into different areas of the body, particularly the abdomen. So I did look up some stats on different countries. Rwanda is the highest in food derived from carbohydrates. 82% of their food comes from carbohydrates. Burundi, Bangladesh, Congo, and Ethiopia, all those, Madagascar, very close to 80%. So they are going to be lacking in protein, maybe lacking in fats, just because so much of their diet is coming from carbohydrates. If you do have excess carbohydrates, you are at risk for things like obesity, diabetes mellitus, which you guys just did a critical thinking assignment on, nutritional deficits. So if you're getting all your nutrients from carbs, okay, all your food is carbs, you're going to be lacking in those proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. You're more prone to dental caries, so cavities, gastrointestinal irritation, and then elevated fats or triglycerides in your blood plasma. Now, if you don't have enough carbohydrates, you will see tissue wasting and extreme deprivation. And actually, a lot of times, because simple carbohydrates don't involve digestion, because when you digest, you're actually burning calories as you digest food. With simple carbohydrates, you're just straight absorbing it. There's no chemical breakdown that's happening. They're already in their simplest form for the most part. And even if they're a disaccharide, it doesn't take much to break them down into a monosaccharide. So a lot of times, if you are put on a diet by a physician or a trainer or whatever, they will tell you to limit your simple carbohydrates as well as your complex carbohydrates as well. But you do need carbs. Okay, you do need carbs. But you'll get more out of complex carbohydrates than you will simple carbohydrates. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about how depriving yourself of carbohydrates, like the popular keto diet, could put you at risk for metabolic acidosis. But we'll talk about that when we get into fats next, I think. And I think that is it. Yeah, that is it for this part of the lecture. So I will there's going to be another video right below this one where I get into lipids. So I'll see you then.